Game of Thrones. This went from being one of the most well-received and highly acclaimed shows to ever hit the airwaves to the most infamous and indignant crash in cinematic or television history. How did this happen? I think, like all great stories, to truly understand the tragedy of a Game of Thrones, you have to go back to the beginning. 1996. George R. R. Martin writes Game of Thrones, and it's initially received pretty well, but he keeps turning down offers to turn it into a movie or some other sort of cinematic production for 15 straight years until 2011. So, why did he say yes, and what changed to make him say it? Well, now we know what the answer is, right? We know that David Benioff and Dan Weiss took him out for the famous R+L=J dinner, where George R. R. Martin asked the two of them the big question: who's Jon Snow's mom? And of course the correlate question to who's Jon Snow's mom is, who is Jon Snow's daddy and what does he do? And they give him their answer, George R. R. Martin confirms that it is correct, and that is what convinces him that these guys want to tell his story. And this is where I think the fatal misstep was made. Also, just a quick disclaimer, I'm just a guy, I haven't seen the contracts or anything, so I'm just speculating about all this stuff like everybody else. But I think what happened was George R. R. Martin probably gave David Benioff and Dan Weiss something that is commonly referred to as a key man clause. Now, what is a key man clause? A key man clause is a clause that you put in a contract that says if a particular party who is essential to the operation of a project exits that project, then all bets are off. And all sorts of consequences can flow from the triggering of a key man clause. Maybe money needs to be paid out, maybe rights get to be renegotiated, or maybe the entire project is just dead in the water. And so I think what probably happened is that George R. R. Martin would have given David Benioff and Dan Weiss a key man clause that would have guaranteed them the right to see how the HBO series ended. I imagine George R. R. Martin would have been motivated to do this after the R+L=J dinner because he thought, if these guys want to tell my story, then I want to make sure they are there to see it all the way through to the finish line, because I don't want the studio replacing them with a different set of filmmakers who might change my story in some way that's more commercially expeditious, but isn't true to the art that I'm trying to make. And tragically, I think this is an example of George R. R. Martin meeting his fate on exactly the road he took to avoid it. Because it is at this point that that great demon greed, which so frequently ruins all which is best in human enterprise, enters our story. Stage right. I believe what happened is that David Benioff and Dan Weiss got wind that there was the big money project of all big money projects, a Star Wars trilogy. And at this point, I'd imagine that these two guys are thinking to themselves that they have been directing and running this show for years, they've given up a huge amount of their lives for it, they probably want to wrap it up and get it finished, but they don't want to hand it off to somebody else, because that would mean when the final credits roll on the final episode of the final season, it's going to be somebody else's name on there finishing things off and not theirs, and I'm betting they just didn't want that to happen. And so maybe it was wanton cruelty towards the audience or just plain hubristic overbelief in their own artistic abilities, but they seem to have authentically thought that they could actually wrap things up in an adequate and sufficient way with that one abbreviated season 8. And we all saw how that went. And so this is how I think David Benioff and Dan Weiss actually accidentally told the true story at the heart of Game of Thrones without intending to and while destroying it. Because when you think about it, what's at the heart of the story of a Game of Thrones? It's the Game of Thrones, right? It's that process of how do we pick who's going to sit on the throne? How do we decide and choose who's going to be best to lead us? And I think we just got a live in the wild example of the principle that greed does not equal good leadership. And I think that's a lesson we all need to take to heart right now, especially here in North America, because it really does seem like the whole way we got to this deeply unpleasant situation we're in right now is by allowing all of our leadership selection criteria to basically just deteriorate to saying, well, whoever's engaged in the most greed, which we will measure by accumulation of money, they should be in charge and have large-scale responsibility of leadership with basically no oversight or accountability to anybody. And I think if we keep allowing that type of fundamentally lazy thinking to dominate our decision-making processes, then our countries and our lives are probably going to turn out about as well as Season 8 did.